Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, and here with video on YouTube. We have been doing a number of shows that have dealt with Scientology. We've been doing a number of shows that have talked about current events and even, in politics and things like that. And this show, we're going to kind of combine these two things a bit because we're going to be talking with Dr. Darrel Ray, he's a doctor of psychology and a podcaster, fellow podcaster, who I have been on his show. Now he's being on mine. And his podcast deals with issues of sex and sexuality. And we discussed Scientology practices and beliefs in regards to, sex and sexual behavior and LGBT and all that sort of thing when I was on his show. We're going to talk in this episode about more current events. I think you'd have to be in a cave to not know that there is a laundry list of people who have been accused of various sexual assault, misbehavior, rape. I mean, a full spectrum and gamut of charges are out there and accusations. And this has had quite an impact. Since this has been coming out in October when the New York Times posted a story about Harvey Weinstein, and it's just kind of snowballed from there. So, Dr. Ray, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Chris.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on so we can talk about this. First off, for my viewers, could we just kind of first establish who you are? What's your background in this, and why should anybody be listening to us talk about, a couple old geezers here talking about women and sex and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm an author of several books. The last two were The God Virus and Sex and God. And I've been interested in the whole human sexuality thing for many years. Of course, you mentioned my podcast, Secular Sexuality. I'm a psychologist by training and practiced in several different branches of psychology over period of about 35 years. So I've seen it all in some ways. And I'm very interested in current affairs, always been interested in politics. So watching what's happening now is fascinating. Also very interested in cultural anthropology. And I think we've got a whole cultural shift going on in front of our eyes in some ways. So that'll be fun and interesting to talk about today. So that's kind of who I am.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm very interested in the social psychology of this. This is kind of how I follow these things, is I've always got it in the back of my head that I'm sort of watching, maybe a case or two or three, but watching the social dynamics and watching the effect that it has on our culture and on our society as a whole, right? And even worldwide. I'm endlessly fascinated by these things, right? The influence of Scientology and destructive cults is one thing. The influence of, sexual allegations of this nature and the way that it is impacting on behavior, on the consequences of these accusations and the careers that are being, well, I guess you could say ruined, and not unjustifiably, mind you. I'm not saying that it's a wrong thing that Harvey Weinstein has gone down the way that he has. With all those accusations, if they are true, then he most certainly deserves to not hold a position of power in the way that he did. So it's kind of interesting watching all of this play out kind of from the objective point of view, but then also getting into the details and the outrage and the upset about it too, because, we're part of this world. It's not like we're aliens watching from afar. So let's go ahead and establish a few things. I wanted to kind of get your views on some stuff from as sort of a foundation, and then we can go from there. What would you say constitutes sexual abuse from a psychological perspective? In other words, we know that if you rape somebody or you attack them physically or you assault them, there's no question that's sexual abuse. But maybe the lighter gradients of this, or how far down the spectrum does this go where it's not physical assault and yet it still constitutes sexual abuse? Where do you come at that from?
Well, I think it has not always been this way. I think what we're starting to see is a clarification of what we mean by boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And boundaries are, it's a psychological concept, of course, but not all cultures even understand the different boundary issues. And I think what we're struggling with in our culture right this moment is what comprises a boundary between two human beings. And anything, the easy definition, the easiest I could come up with, is sexual abuse would be anything that crosses a boundary. Now then the question is, well, how do you establish boundaries and what are boundaries?
That's
Well,
exactly right.
yeah, boundaries have at least two components. A physical one, you do not have permission to touch me. So if you do touch me, you have crossed a boundary. It's that simple. And so we're seeing, for example, criticism of Joe Biden. Even though he hasn't been accused of anything, he touches people a lot. And it's uncomfortable for some people. And so you just have to recognize that is a boundary. Now, it's always been there. Just because nobody recognized it or criticized it didn't mean the person being touched didn't feel uncomfortable or even offended or even violated by a touch that was inappropriate. So that's a physical boundary, and those are easy to see, but within the cultural constructs, not always easy to understand because obviously Joe Biden thinks he's fine in touching people, and those people are now saying no, it's not okay for you to touch me, Joe Biden. And I love Joe Biden. I think he's a great guy. He's from a different time and place, obviously. And so he probably, as a politician, glad hands and touches people all the time, and that's a part of his shtick. But that's changing now.
It's yeah, that's an
What
interesting
Joe and
point.
other
Yeah.
people don't realize, and I don't want to just pick on Joe, but it's such a great example of a boundary that's not really abusive, but makes people feel uncomfortable. So anything beyond what Joe Biden is doing is clearly abusive. I mean, we're talking. You see Al Franken, and Al Franken's pretending to touch a woman's breasts, or whether he did or not, another question. But even joking about that 10 or 15 years ago may not have been seen as a violation from the male perspective, and now, but it was from the female perspective. But nobody acknowledged that. What we're starting to see is people are acknowledging, yeah, that was a boundary. It's always been a boundary. I don't care if it was 1850, 1950, or 2017. It was still a boundary. It just wasn't an enforced boundary. Women could not enforce the boundaries on the men around them. And I've met many women who said, my uncle touched me inappropriately, but I didn't dare tell my parents, or they wouldn't believe me, or they would, say I'm seducing him, stuff like that. Well, there's lots of places where that's still going on, even in Alabama, especially in Alabama, maybe.
Well, that's actually that brings to mind a good point about this, which I'll just bring up right now. And I don't know that we need to do a whole segue here, but just as a point of culture, it's almost, in certain areas, it's part of the culture that you touch
Right.
others in such a way that that's how you demonstrate affection, even familial affection. Little children are taught, well, grandma's, I don't like grandma kissing me. Her lips are slimy. Well, that's your problem, little girl or little boy. That's not on grandma.
Right.
That's on you, right?
Yeah.
What do you mean you don't like your uncle hugging you? He's just being affectionate. He's your uncle. You're supposed to love your uncle. So that, I think, it might be an area where that sort of thing takes root,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Is
I think it does. Yeah.
those familial connections, and then you're sort of creating exceptions to these boundaries. And I'm kind of, a little old school on that. Like, I watched Joe Biden, for example, just to talk about him, on Colbert the other night, and it was very clear in watching him that he was touchy. He touched Stephen Colbert a number of times. He reached over and
Right.
grabbed him by the wrist, grabbed him by the arm. And it was clear to me that his touching was not of a sexual nature. It was a connection for him. It was and I've done the same thing. And so I'm simply talking about this. I'm not making value judgments and trying to rationalize what,
Right.
that it has to be this way. I'm merely saying that in the mind of the people who do it, you're trying to create a connection. with the person you're talking to, and
Yeah.
however, and so it can be coming from a good, innocent place, and yet this position of, well, yes, it is crossing a boundary. It's legit, it really is.
Yeah, it is. And we were raised as we're raised, and I was raised in a very touchy-feely home. We hugged and kissed each other all the time. My dad
Mm-hmm.
kissed me well until I was in adulthood, and I felt that was really special that my dad and I had that kind of level of physical contact. There was nothing sexual about it on either of our parts, and same thing for my brothers. I were 4 boys in our family.
Mm-hmm.
So, and my grandfather touched constantly, and he was a school teacher, an elementary school teacher, and he would always hug kids. And I would be in, say, a grocery store with my grandpa, and kids would just, grown adults would come up and just grab him and hug him because he was their teacher, 20 years ago or 30 years ago at the time. And that just was, he was such a huggy person. However, I met a number of people later in his life after he was no longer a teacher who didn't want him touching him or hugging him. And that surprised me. Well, why wouldn't you want my grandpa hugging you? He's the kindest person on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first clue. I'm probably, I don't know, 25 years old, and people are saying, no, I don't want your grandpa touching me. And wow, that's a whole new perspective I hadn't even thought about. Not one.
Mm-hmm.
I want my grandpa touching me. They don't. All those children that he was with wanted, but they don't. So what I learned at that point was each person has their own boundaries and their own preferences, and we need to find out what those are before we act, before we take the before we touch somebody without permission, without checking it out with them. People come up and
Yeah.
hug me. I don't know why. I must exude huggability. I don't know. People just will. People I've never met, all we are is Facebook friends, will come up and hug me. And I've gotten used to it. It's okay. It doesn't violate any boundaries for me. But I certainly wouldn't want to go up to them and hug them if I hadn't asked permission first or gotten clear signals. And I don't
Right.
think Joe Biden and people like that have done it. But I mean, it's a little off topic, but I think it illustrates what you're saying. It starts when we're children,
Yeah.
and
I
your family of origin may be the place you're learning this stuff.
and yeah, and I don't know that this is so rapidly off topic because these are the baby steps that lead to, I'm not saying that we're all potentially sexual predators because we like to touch people. I'm saying that culturally, socially, these are the places where it's acceptable, and then we get confused because then you have guys or women, I mean, it works both ways, who can be predatory, and they'll take advantage of that, and they'll be touchy-feely, and then they'll take that opportunity to, make a grab or do something that is clearly inappropriate, but they'll use that social grace or that socially acceptable hug or pat or something like that to gain advantage, and that's where things go really off the rails really fast, and it confuses people. And I think older people more so than younger people because of that socially acceptable thing where it's not even socially acceptable. You're raised to expect, to be that way. I mean, for example, what's the professional greeting? A handshake. It's a touch.
Right, right.
You know, if you
But
refused
it's
a
ritual.
handshake, somebody
But
would
it's
be
rich.
like, "What's your problem?"
It's ritualistic,
Yes.
and ritualistic is very different than what we're talking about here. A handshake is something we ritually expect, and there's some people who don't even shake hands, and I've gotten sensitive to that. People who have maybe body hypersensitivity in their own bodies, and they don't want to be touched at all. So
Right.
I have to be sensitive to that, and I think as a culture, we're learning very slowly. Unfortunately, we're learning how to be sensitive to those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something earlier, and I think that's where we were interested in going today, and that is, well, when it moves from the benign stuff that grandpa touching you, or a ritual like handshake, to people taking advantage. What is going on that motivates them, or that allows them, or makes them even think they should or shouldn't do that? And I think there's several components to that, but probably the earliest component is early childhood training, of course. But sometimes there's pretty nasty childhood training. If your parents hit you as a child, they are I mean, it's pretty intuitive. They're violating you in some way, shape, or form. And if you hit each other as siblings, you're violating each other. And if you grow up in a culture where things like that are just normal, and I did. I grew up with 4 boys, and we were hitting each other all the time. There was fights, and it was fun, but sometimes it was out of anger. But what I could see was occasionally, and other families wouldn't recognize it, wouldn't understand that if they saw it in us. They would say, wow, those kids are really violent with each other. But what if that wasn't a positive cultural norm in your family?
Mm-hmm.
What if there were girls in the family? And what if, because there were just boys here in that sense. And I'm not making any comment about whether any of us were or were not gay. It's irrelevant here. That was just our culture. The problem is, what if there was a girl in that, and we were allowed to hit on the girl, or beat up on her, or put her down, or shame her? And there are families where that is taught from the very beginning, from birth, practically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in our not just in our culture, but especially in religious cultures, Islam, for example, women are second-class citizens from the day they're born. And it's true in U.S. culture. Women have been second-class citizens and still are in many cases. So if you've been given permission as a boy from very early on to dominate girls and women, you may internalize that in a way that doesn't respect their autonomy or their boundaries. And I think there are people, and I've known a number of people, who simply don't know how to respect other people's boundaries because they think they have a right. They had a right when they were a child,
Right,
to respond inappropriately to their mother or to their sister or to their aunt, and nobody called them on it. So why not now?
right.
Especially highly privileged people, very wealthy or white, or kinds of people who've got a lot of power. They may, if that was the way they're growing up, they still may not have any sense of boundaries. So,
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's right. I'm always looking for ways to explain, analogies, metaphors, whatever, that might help people understand this sort of thing. When I was learning about, when I was re-educating myself, I should say, about the whole array and subject of LGBT after coming out of Scientology, George Takei was very helpful to me in that regard, because he made on social media really great metaphors and analogies that helped me to overcome my prejudices and the biases that Scientology had installed.
right.
And so I always look for those things. And I think this idea of, well, would you be okay with somebody walking up and hitting you? Well,
Right.
yeah, no, of course I wouldn't, especially grown-ass adult, right? Yeah, no, absolutely not. Well, good. That's, if you just, lessen that a little bit and go, well, there are some people who are just not okay with you going up and touching them in the same way. They have the exact same response
Right.
to if I walked up and hit you, you'd be like, hey, you want to go out in the parking lot? What the hell, right? You know,
Yeah.
well, that's how they feel when you even touch them.
Right.
Trying to get that across to somebody, like, oh, okay, it's something they can understand that overcomes the bias that, well, of course it's okay. What's the problem? I don't understand. Why is this an issue? It's never been an issue. I've been raised this way. I've always been this way. So I think that it is root biases like that we have to look for and deal with in order to more quickly move this ball down the road of changing the cultural social norms on
And I
this.
think that's going to come with a discussion about boundaries. And that's
Yeah.
why I wanted to
Good.
start here today.
Good.
You start with that discussion, and I don't think people are talking explicitly enough. I'd like to see a lot more discussion around boundaries and what are boundaries and how people establish them around their bodies and around their persona as well. It's not just I can violate somebody's boundaries with a shaming word on them, for example, or something like that. But we're not going there just yet. I want to stick with this childhood thing because,
Yeah.
for example, a friend of mine works in a preschool, and there's a child in the preschool that's been hitting a boy that's been hitting other people quite spontaneously. And so with a parent conference recently, that person said, this is a violation of these other children's boundaries. and you've got to get this under control at home and here, or this child may not be able to stay here any longer, or that kind of a discussion happened. Well, the parent defended the kid, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, he was provoked. It was the other kid's fault. Well, this has happened dozens of times. So that means all the other kids are at fault.
Right.
It almost sounds like a Donald Trump thing if you think about it. Everybody else is at fault here. I am never the one that caused the problem or had any part of the problem, and that's what this children and the parents are facilitating that perception on the kid's part. Anything can provoke him to hit somebody. You look at him wrong, or you don't look at him when he wants to be looked at. It doesn't matter. He's going to hit you, and then he will have an excuse for hitting you. That's exactly what we're seeing out of the president of the United States, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And we know he violates people's boundaries. You just look at the way he shakes people's hands. His handshake itself is a violation of other people's physical boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And people have noticed this in him. And I'm considering. I think we could consider this. We know he was a damn spoiled brat when he was being raised up, and probably Harvey Weinstein was a spoiled brat, and who knows, all these other people that are being named. Were they taught these boundaries? Were these boundaries enforced on them from very early on? If not, they probably felt like they had an entitlement to violate other people's boundaries.
Yep.
Nobody's ever called them on it. And they get in the business world. The Harvey Weinsteins get in the business world. They willy-nilly violate people's boundaries. Nobody calls them on them. They get worse at it. They think that's the norm. It's okay. What they read in the papers, women don't like that. Well, that's just in the papers. My women like it. The women I violate like it, or whatever.
Right. Well, they rationalize it. They totally rationalize it. And I think the key word here is entitlement.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about, the violation, the offense is violating boundaries, right? And so I think you're spot on that we need to be aware of the fact that boundaries exist, that people, you should respect people's boundaries, that you should respect, because it's part of respecting who they are, right? If you're going to respect if you're going to respect somebody, that comes down to tolerance of belief, tolerance of ideas, and tolerance of boundaries, that person has their ideas of what makes them comfortable and able to live their life. And you don't have to, it's not on you to tell them what their boundaries are. Yeah. Part of respect is recognizing, acknowledging, and, and agreeing that this person's boundaries are up to them to decide what they are. I think one of the growing pains here is the cultural bias versus that newer idea or attitude. So some older people who haven't been raised that way are like, well, what's the problem? I don't get it. It's on them. It's their fault. As reflected even by that parent and kid you were talking about there, where it's everybody else's fault. That this kid's running around hitting people.
Yeah.
That's a good example of how this kind of thing is set in place in the first place.
Right. Now you go, if then we move to the psychological boundary violations. If you go to a culture like you see in Alabama, where women are seen as objects to be protected, and the whole Southern Belle kind of bullshit and all that sort of thing. Well, you've got a whole system whereby they're kind of arbitrary or unnatural boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I lived in the South for 6 years, and I watched how they treated women, people of color, and it was clear there's lots of sexism, lots of racism in the South, but it's very polite. It's just papered over. It's just so nice. And if you violate the cultural boundaries, that's not okay. But violating the human boundaries is okay in that system. So you could call people inappropriate names, what you and I would clearly identify as inappropriate back then, and that would not be a violation of the cultural norm, but it would be a violation of the personal norm, and nobody would call them on it. And they would question women. I would see this frequently. what is the woman's motivation? And we're seeing this right now. When women come out and say, I was violated by this politician or by this business person, first thing that comes out is, well, what did you do to encourage that behavior?
Right. Your dress, your behavior, your
That
actions. That's right.
very strong in the South. And we're kind of seeing that right now in the Roy Moore episodes,
Mm-hmm.
where people are saying, and Roy himself is doing this, and it's really, really religiously motivated. Because within the Southern religious culture, your dress entices men, and so you are at fault by default.
Mm-hmm.
Female number one. That's one.
Mm-hmm.
You wore the wrong dress. Of course, you could wear a hijab, and you'd still get violated. And what we see this in Islam, just because you wear hijab does not mean you're not going to get attacked, raped, violated in some way.
No.
So
But the entire attitude is victim blaming,
yeah,
right out of the gates. And this
right,
is not, we're not making this up. I did an entire video about this Bill Gothard group, and this
oh,
is religious, right?
oh, right,
In nature, because it comes back down to this, women were the original tempters. Women, it all goes back to, if you really dig down into the details of this, it always goes back to the Bible and the fact that the original sin, and it was on the woman because she
right.
was the one who got tempted. And even if people aren't consciously aware of where this bias comes from, I'm telling you right now, this is where it comes from.
It's
It,
baked.
you know,
It's baked right into the DNA of Christianity and Judaism.
that
Both.
exactly. That's exactly right. And that's where this whole attitude that women are second-class citizens, that women are the temptresses, that women are the ones who are responsible for the man's behavior towards them comes from. And
Right.
we really need to get better at this, and
Yeah.
dump
Hey,
that.
what we're seeing, I think, is playing out in the Roy Moore thing is who's defending this obvious asshole. No, can I use that word on
Yeah,
this?
no, it's all good. I would say fucking asshole.
I would use that term too. There's so much evidence against this guy, not
Right.
to say nothing of being kicked out of the Supreme Court twice. I mean, there's just
Oh,
and
there's a
take
laundry list of things this guy has been involved
inappropriately
in.
taking
Oh
taking money
yeah,
from his own charity and stuff like that.
yeah.
So the guy is culpable in so many different ways, not just sexual.
Hmm.
And yet the key component is he's a part of the Southern tribe, the Southern Alabama
That's
Civil
right.
War tribe that was designed and created to make sure that women and blacks are kept in their place.
That's right.
So anybody that tries to um, disrespect Roy Moore is pushing against that cultural norm. And I mentioned earlier, you can violate a person's individual boundaries in the South, but don't violate the cultural boundaries.
Hmm.
And that's what we're seeing here. Roy Moore was violating women's boundaries all over the place, among other things, and nobody seems too concerned about it. But and the women and people who are kicking back to him, pushing back on him, they're seen as violating the Southern cultural norms about
Hmm.
respect for women and Jesus and religion, and the foundation of our culture is basically white supremacy. And that's really what they're pushing back on.
Yeah.
So the entire state of Alabama, among other places, of course, is having to do some real soul searching here. I think we're seeing some of that, the soul searching going on.
Yeah.
We'll find out at the end of the special election whether the soul searching went far enough or not.
Well, exactly. I think the ball is moving down the road ever so slightly, and we will see whether, Roy Moore gets a pass or not. But even if he does, this isn't going to be forgotten. It's not like what's happening right now is all just going to be erased from history. These things are the things that push the ball down the road, even if it's not as fast as any of us would like it to happen. I've often said that cultural change is a multi-generational thing, and you just
Yeah.
have to deal with that.
I think it's going to be interesting, especially if he wins the election, because right now we have Al Franken being investigated through the ethics committee with his full cooperation, of course.
Well, at least it's
He's
been requested.
request.
Whether it happens or not, we'll see. Yeah.
His apology has been accepted by the woman that he violated, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Well, Roy Moore comes in, and what he did was so many more times that, I mean, the documentation at least, so many more times, and
Oh
so
yeah.
many things he did, including underage pedophilia, it looks like, or pederast,
Oh,
really.
oh yeah. Yeah. Without question, those are
So
amongst the accusations.
what is the Senate going to do if they start pressuring people out for violations? I'm guessing there's a hell of a lot of male senators that are gonna sooner or later get outed. there, there's going to be a national coming to terms with this.
Yep.
If you know, how do we manage this kind of thing? Here's what's happening, and I think this is fascinating. We before we got on the podcast today, you and I mentioned a bit. I see a paradigm shift happening.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it's a generational thing. Yeah, I think sometimes it's generational, but occasionally you see a paradigm shift that happens really fast. And there are examples in our history where there were paradigm shifts that happened in a relatively short period of time. I mean, obviously there was a huge paradigm shift in this 10 or 15 years running up to the Civil War, for example. There was a huge paradigm shift in the 1820s around the big revivals and the religious revivals and the way that happened. You could see a paradigm shift in the 1890s around temperance and women's suffrage. Now, they kind of go in the opposite directions, but they were still a paradigm shift. You know, this paradigm shift that temperance is good and should be enforced by law, that was a paradigm shift from what it was in the 1880s.
Very
And
much
then
so. Yeah.
the other direction, you see the paradigm shift moving towards women's suffrage and that women should have the right to vote. I mean, all these things are paradigm shifts, and they did happen when they finally hit. They happened fairly quickly in geological terms, cultural geology. And I think what we saw that shift, say, in 1921, when the 19th Amendment, I forget the number of the amendment or the year of women got the right to vote.
Oh yeah, suffrage. Yeah. Early
Suffrage,
1900s.
but
Yeah.
World War I actually delayed that. It probably would have happened, may have happened even earlier, had not been for World War I. But that was a huge paradigm shift. And what we're seeing now is the culture, the behavior and the culture are coming up against each other, and they're butting heads, and it's a powerful force hitting a powerful force.
Mm-hmm.
One of those two is going to have to back off.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, like we saw in the civil rights movement, there was lots of civil rights workers in the late 1800s. There was lots of civil rights workers in the 1920s and 30s. I met some of the oldest civil rights workers back. They were in the 80s, even 90s, when I was going to graduate school and had an opportunity to meet some of these amazing people that put their life on the line for civil rights in the 20s and 30s. But the shift didn't happen. It didn't happen until the 1950s and later, into the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
The thing happens when a paradigm shift happens. It goes. I almost liken it chemically to an enzyme, a chemical reaction. I took chemistry in high school, so
I see. Okay.
I didn't do too well.
Okay.
But we did these experiments where you would take a chemical, you'd have a vial of one chemical, and you'd just drop another chemical in it, and it would be clear. Let's say the liquid inside the main vial is clear. And you just drop one drop and one drop and one drop of another chemical, and it stays clear until the 27th drop you put into that, and all of a sudden, bang, it turns blue.
Yep.
And it's a chemical reaction. Well, you kind of see that in our culture. The drops have been coming, and they've been coming for decades. Anita Hill was a clear example, and not enough people believed her, but she started something there. And now of course we paid the price because nobody listened to her. Long Dong Silver got into the Supreme Court.
Yep.
And that was his own name for himself. Clarence Thomas.
If you all remember the ancient history of the Senate confirmation hearings and all of that, it was a messy business. but
Yeah,
he did end up getting confirmed, and her testimony was basically pushed to the side.
right. Yeah. So anyway, there's lots of interesting drips happening.
That's right. And that's the when you really get into, where change occurs, that's why I talk about multi-generational, because when you have to go back to those original drops, you're talking about things that might have happened 100 years ago, but it puts things in motion that allow that sudden shift to happen,
Right.
which was really decades in the making,
Right. Right.
and I think that is what we're seeing now.
And I can't help but connect Black Lives Matter, for example, with the sexual harassment. Both are drops that have been dropping a lot
Hmm.
and increasing in speed,
Hmm.
and they're not unrelated. I mean, the treatment of minorities and blacks specifically in our culture by authority figures is not unlike the patriarchy's treatment of women, because it's both patriarch, it's both
Oh yeah,
supremacy.
and
One or not.
I will extend that to Latinos as well.
Exactly.
I mean, you look at what Donald Trump, sort of fanned the flames of in order to get into office, anti-immigration,
Right.
and what immigrants was he talking about?
Yeah.
He was talking about immigrants from Mexico. He was not. Nobody was pissed off or upset about immigrants coming in from India or from the UK, right? But those guys from Mexico, look out. So I think it applies just as much to that too. I'm simply extending what you're
Yeah.
saying. I'm
Yeah.
agreeing with you completely.
Yeah. So it's a part of the paradigm shift. Sooner or
Hmm.
later, pressure, I think, is we're seeing the pressure build up.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
We
the
really need
days.
to. We really need to. Put our money where our mouth is. And by we, I mean us white folk. Uh, Culturally now, I'm not talking about you or me as individuals, but as a group. When we talk about equality, when we talk about equality under the law, when we talk about social
Mhm.
equality, we really need to, uh, you know, sort of face up to what that really means, and kind of cancel the old boys club mentality that still exists in many circles.
Yeah, I think the danger right now is the same danger that happened prior to World War One. It's pretty clear that women's suffrage would have happened in England and the United States quicker had there not been a World War One.
Hmm.
And right now, if there was some kind of major crisis that could short circuit what's going on,
Hmm.
and in both cases, for example, blacks volunteered in great numbers to go fight in World War One, and they volunteered in great numbers to go fight in World War Two,
Hmm.
with the expectation that when they got back, they would be able, to have greater freedoms and more respect in the culture. It did not happen.
Right.
Even though blacks fought in the Civil War in great numbers, obviously, and even in the Revolutionary War, it didn't matter. The supremacy, the white supremacist patriarchy is really strong. So what we have to do, I think, is be aware as activists, as people wanting greater justice in our culture, that we cannot let um, manufactured crises or even real crises get in the way of this. We can't let Donald Trump create a reason for not giving more respect to women, well, or blacks or anybody else. It's just and I'm worried that some manufactured thing's going to happen.
Well,
Also,
it would not be too hard to see that there are a number of factors in play, and human beings are not great at multitasking.
no, they're not.
I mean, it very well could. What you're saying right now, I mean, Korea, China, Afghanistan, Iran. I mean, there are a number of foreign relations issues that are being grossly mishandled by our State Department and White House right now, and any one of them could become a powder keg
Yeah,
of trouble for us. And I don't even need to go into Donald Trump is crafting it to be that way. His
right.
incompetence is what's making
Yeah,
it that way. So sure, manufactured to that degree. But you're right. We don't multitask well, and all you have to do is look at the nature of our cable news networks, regard on any spectrum, on any side. left, right, Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, to see that we don't multitask well. If
Right.
there's about 3 or 4 major stories that get juggled, in the air at any one time, and that's about as much as we can deal with,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So I think you're making a good point that we need to stay on point with this, and we need to push this through, and hopefully not be distracted off onto other things. But there is such a list of people now who have been accused
Right.
of misconduct, and the varying. And here's maybe how I'd like to get into this for a final segment is the mentality of those who support the perpetrators. This is something we agreed we wanted to talk about, and I would like to get into this because this also has a lot to do with the stuff I talk about on my show all the time, which has to do with destructive cult mentality, which goes into tribalism and us versus them. And we see that right now. I mean, Danny Masterson is, I said I was gonna combine these worlds. Let me just combine them right now by saying Danny Masterson is a person who has currently got 4 women accusing him of raping them, including a couple of them were Scientologists at the time.
Yeah.
And this is being so well filtered that it's not even coming out. He's on Netflix, just like Kevin Spacey was. His show has been renewed for another season, the one that he's on, called The Ranch. Whereas Kevin Spacey has accusations come out against him, he acknowledges that there was wrongdoing, and House of Cards canceled, every project he's on canceled, and he's off in therapy, and we're not hearing from Kevin Spacey at this point, which is probably a good thing. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly what he should be doing right now.
I just hope he's getting the right kind of therapy, because the bullshit
Yes.
sex addiction therapy ain't going to help him a bit. It may reinforce the very behavior that he engaged in.
No, I think he needs
engaging in it.
Absolutely. I think he needs a whole roto-rooter, and on the nature of what along the nature of what we've been talking about here on this podcast, about learning about boundaries and
Yeah.
conduct and respect, and what does that really mean,
Yeah.
But let's get into this business of those who support perpetrators. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you touched on, of course, and this word tribalism has been bandied around a lot. It's almost become trite. But let me just put it in real basic neurobiological terms.
Mm-hmm.
As human beings, like you said, we don't multitask very well. We only can really have any kind of relationship with a really close relationship with somewhere around 12 people. I mean, just the numbers, you get too big, and you don't have enough time in your life to have a good close relationship. So let's just say that the average person at best can have 12 close relationships. And that's probably the upper end. For many people, it'll be much lower than that. At the same time, you can only really have any kind of relationship, a one-on-one, with about 150 people. And there's lots of good research on this as well, especially in the corporate world. I mean, there's interesting research. I'm not going to go into it here, but
I like these numbers. This is a good point you're making.
Yeah. So once people grab on to a relationship, that sticks in their head. They're not going to be switching relationships. They just can't. It's not that easy to switch relationship. So outside of that 150, and we all have more people in our brains than 150.
Oh yeah.
But we have to use shorthand or shortcuts to determine, is that person is that person friendly to me and my culture, or is it an enemy of me and my culture? And Fox News is great about tripping that stuff. Excuse me. That kind of thing that Fox News does really creates shorthand for, this is our friend, this is our ally, this is our enemy. And the more black and white it can be, the easier it is, because the human brain doesn't want to work that hard.
Right. And in all fairness, MSNBC and CNN do the exact same thing. I mean, if we're really going to be honest about it.
I'm not gonna argue with that. Absolutely. Yeah. Kahneman's book on thinking fast and slow. He has a great way of looking at the way the brain functions. He said there's fast thinking and there's slow thinking, system 1 and system 2. And fast thinking is real easy, because we learn it from the day we're born, and we just learn, okay, white people are good, black people are bad. That's
Right.
black and white, fast thinking. But when you get into adulthood and the nuances of the world around us start coming into us, then we have to engage slow thinking, system two thinking, and that's much more difficult. In fact, I think he's got some numbers on that, 8 times more energy or more than that energy to think slow than it is to think fast, because you're rethinking, you're re-examining. That's really hard. It's hard for any human being. But the average person doesn't engage system two thinking very often and can't. It just takes a lot of energy. And hey, you got 3 kids to raise, you got a job to do.
Right.
You sit down, you look at the news, you don't have time to process. You and I probably spend more time processing the way the State Department is being run right now than any 50 people in any other 50 people, right?
Right.
And that's not because they're wrong. It's we probably have the time or the inclination. I don't particularly want to go out and work on my car at night, but I know guys that do,
Mm-hmm.
and that's their inclination. I just take mine to a mechanic. So we have inclinations and focuses. Right now, the culture is being pushed pretty hard. There's a lot of information coming in really fast. And there's a few key thinkers that are probably going to help focus this and help push that paradigm shift over. But they're right now fighting among each other. And when they finally win, whoever these key thinkers are, then the culture is probably going to follow them. And I'm hoping it's not Donald Trump that's for those key thinkers. But so far, he's been able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Why do people support Roy Moore? Why do people support the pussy grabber in chief? Well, because it's easy, black and white. I've
Mm-hmm.
got my mind settled. I now don't have to put any energy in there. I can go work on my car, or I can
Right.
go shopping, or I can deal with the 3 kids that are fighting in the living room right now.
And to be clear, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for just a second, but I really want to be clear about this. That is not to say that people who support Donald Trump are simpletons or are not capable of, what was it? You said there's situation two thinking?
System one, system two,
System
yeah,
two, yeah, system two, system one thinking. Clearly, my channel appeals to system two thinking. I push
right.
all the time for people to engage and to bring their brain to the party and really engage in what I'm saying. And I try to get feedback that reflects that. So I don't think you're saying, and I'm certainly not saying that people who fall into these, this black and white thinking, we all do it. And
Yeah, right.
it's not a matter of labeling somebody a simpleton or a simple thinker. And I just know that there are people who listen to this, and the second we bring up Trump and anything critical about it, they're going to start, connecting dots that we're not connecting and thinking that we're saying things that we're not saying. So I just am going to put that out there as a defensive measure and let you carry on now, because I really want people to get where we're coming from here.
Well,
You
and,
know?
and I want to emphasize that I'm no good at math, no good at all.
Yep.
So for me, I have to engage a lot of system two thinking to do any kind of math besides the most basic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay with the basic stuff, but don't. And yet I've got friends that can. I have a friend that can do the most complex mathematics you can imagine in his head without even writing it down.
Mm-hmm.
He in his system two goes there very easily, and he can do it. But don't ask him to say what's going on at the U.S. State Department right now.
Right.
He
Right.
doesn't give a shit.
That's right.
It's like we all have our own tendencies and proclivities and interests, and that's where we most easily and with most facility can navigate. I've been studying international relations literally since I was about 12 years old. I've got a real facility. I really like that. But I don't know almost no one I know is interested as deeply as I am. So I can engage that pretty easily. And the next person over is engaging in mechanics far beyond anything I'll ever understand. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has nothing to do with intelligence.
Right.
It has more to do with interest, directions of interest that you have in your life. However, that said,
Yep.
the culture itself pushes us in various ways. Culture influences us in various ways.
Big time.
And right now, we were raised in a patriarchal culture where white males are at the pinnacle, the top of the heap.
Yep.
And white males are now being challenged. I don't care whether you want to engage your system to think or you're not. If you want to be in the future, if you want to be a person with good relationships with women or minorities, you're fucking going to have to reprogram your brain a bit, and you're going to have to engage your system to a bit.
Yep.
And that's where I want to take it. I want to take it very personal, because this is not just personal for the listeners we're talking to now. It's personal for Darrel. I do not want to put myself out as having already mastered all this stuff. I am appalled sometimes at my own internal thinking, and I have to stop and challenge that thinking. And it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that I think I really, I was just talking to a friend the other day, about 5 or 6 years ago, I finally was able to put myself in a woman's shoes enough to understand what they're experiencing in the workplace. And I mean, it sounds, I look back and I say, well, how could I have been so dumb? To use a pejorative term. It wasn't dumb. It was cultural programming. Just like I talk about in my books, I've been much more, quote, sexually liberated in some ways than I have liberated around other things. It's a journey that each of us has to engage in. I am still challenging sexist and racist thoughts in my own head. Well, where the hell did those come from? Well, they came from my granny, and they came from my culture, and they came from my neighbors when I was growing up. And I still hear their voices sometimes. When I hear this, some racist thought come into my head, I think, that was Granny's voice. I mean, it's right. Almost clear sometimes. So it's a work, and I'm not there yet. I kind of enjoy the journey, though, because once you get over the hill and recognize that a lot of this shit is my responsibility, and here's some tools. I've got the tools now. I didn't have those tools 20 years ago. Now I've got tools I didn't have. So,
exactly. No, that's a great point. I, of course, immediately relate to that from my own stupidity in my past. I mean, 27 years of being involved in Scientology at a professional level is I don't have laurels to fall back on of good choices in my life. I am at the top of the list of stupid idiots, who made very poor life choices and carried on with those life choices for very long time, before I opened my eyes and was like, what the hell am I involved in, So, the whole attitude here is not, that I, or you or anybody, I don't think anybody's got it all taped. I don't look at anybody as my guru anymore, and I don't think anybody should. I think that I hope to appeal to those people out there who know that they are not, that life is a journey, that there is change possible, that we can always do better, we can always make ourselves better. And if you are listening to this thinking you've got it all figured out and you're all taped, you're probably in the wrong place, because that's coming at it from the point of view of I'm right, you're wrong, there's nothing you can teach me, there's nothing you can show me, I've got everything figured out. That's not the winning attitude in life, So anyway, so I just wanted to I think you and I are both at the same place in recognizing that we've got a long way to go, and we're okay with that,
Exactly. And I think that one of because the tool, I said I've got tools. I don't have all the tools.
Yep.
I really pay close attention to the women around me and to the minorities around me, because they've got tools they've had to in order to survive in the world.
Big time.
They've had to create conceptual tools or emotional tools. And if you listen, they can give you new ways of thinking about the world around. And I think this notion that we're autonomous. One of the more dangerous things I think we carry around inside of us is that we are skeptical, autonomous, intelligent, thinking human beings. Until one day you hit a brick wall and you realize, fuck, I'm as sexist as my father was.
Right.
Or I'm as racist as my granny was,
Yep.
somewhere in my own head. Then you realize, no, I'm not autonomous. I'm not skeptical. I still believe shit that ain't true.
Yep.
And the evidence has been in front of my eyes for decades. And it finally hits me one day. That's a hard lesson to, I think, for many of us to learn, me included, is I'm not as critical, I'm not as skeptical, I'm not as intelligent, I'm not as autonomous as I think I am.
Right.
So once you acknowledge that, then you can open your eyes and your mind up and start learning from other people because they've got a lot to teach us. They do.
Exactly. Exactly. And all of this is very relevant. Everything we were just talking about for the last 10 minutes is the foundation of getting out of tribal thinking, or what I used to refer to as pack thinking. I mean,
Yeah,
herd mentality,
right.
however you want to describe it, right? And 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 there is no question that we have a problem with that as human beings, and especially in certain areas, their cultural norms are more reinforced than others.
Right.
I'm talking to you, South, right? Alabama right now, specifically, because it's a hot topic item and they're under the microscope. Just because we're talking about Alabama today doesn't mean we can't be talking about Colorado tomorrow, or California for that matter. All of these places have cultural norms installed that are not necessarily great things. And we
Right.
just happen to be looking at Alabama right now. But you have to acknowledge that when you have people saying, "Oh, I would rather have a sexual predator and pederast in office than a Democrat," we have really lost the plot. I mean, that is just how I don't even, and I have seen tweets and remarks in media saying exactly that.
Yeah.
And these are people who are just going to be kicking themselves when they realize, what fools they sound like for engaging in that kind of thinking. you know
Yeah.
so all right. Well, so all of what we just said about self-awareness, self-examination, willing to change, willing to look at, how we might not be you know, the masters of intellect we think we are. It's okay. It's acceptable. I think that's what we're really trying to say. Is it's okay to, uh, say, hey, maybe I was wrong about that, and take another look. And that's the essence of critical thinking. So that totally aligns with, the whole point of my channel.
I had I was in a gift shop a year or so ago and I saw this plaque. I bought it on the spot. It says, "Poor choices make great stories."
Yes.
And,
Yes.
I think I thought about that. That's really true. Some of my best stories come from some of the dumbest things I ever did. But you got to first admit it was a dumb thing because you can keep making those bad choices over and over and over again.
Yep.
And I think creating our own stories. Our parents gave us stories. Our grandparents gave us stories. Now, I don't mean stories in the sense of bedtime stories. I'm talking about a narrative about who you are in the world and what your place in the world is. And we don't challenge those. They're just in our brains and we just go on automatic pilot. That's system one thinking.
Yep.
But as you engage system two thinking and think about it, what is that story? Is that a story functional for me, for my culture, for other people in my life? And can I create a new story? That's what I think. I'm actively creating a new story. And the way I do that is by identifying bad choices that I thought were good choices at the time. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, nobody makes a bad choice intentionally. You make
Right.
you make a good choice based on the best information you have at that moment. You're doing the best you can with what you have.
Yep.
And I look back and I think, damn, I was sexist, I was racist, I was ableist, I had crazy ideas about gays. You just go down the list and I can see bad choices in retrospect that felt right at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if
Exactly.
we all engage in that exercise on a regular basis, we'll all become better people, I think.
And really, in the end, at the end of the day, what else can you really ask for?
Right.
You do your best, and you try to get along with others, and you try to, make the world a better place in whatever small or big ways we can.
Right.
So, all right. Well, Darrel, thank you very much for being on the show here and chatting with me about this.
My pleasure, Chris. I really enjoyed doing this. A lot
Great.
of fun, I
Yeah.
guess. You talking about this?
No, absolutely. I know it's a horrible topic that we started on, but I think I always try to, move with a lesson. What's the lesson here? What can we learn? What can we do about this? How can we make it better as a result of this? And I think the things we're talking about in this podcast are in that direction.
Right.
We're not sitting here, salivating over all the salacious bits and oh, good, I'm so glad all these horrible guys are now in trouble. I'm not happy that that's happening. I'm happy that the awareness is rising. I'm happy that the behavior will change as a result, and we'll have a more free and better and more equal society for all of us as a result. And if these are the things we have to go through to do it, so be it. You
Right.
know. So that's my effort here, and I'm really glad you partook in this. And I think we have some positive thoughts here. So thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, folks, please leave your comments and feedback on what we've talked about here in the comments section below on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I am always interested in what you guys have to say about this. I learn so much from the good, bad, and sideways, okay? So even if you have, disagree with every single thing we said and thought that we were just completely, muckrakers and horrible, awful people, let me know. And maybe we'll have a conversation about that. And please like, share, spread this around the interwebs, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.